Well, thanks, Jack, for some of those compelling photos and those thoughts about that time in American history where we interned people from Japanese American descent. You know, within Unitarian Universalism, within our thought process, there is this general idea that we want to affect history rather than be simply pushed around by it. So it was with that thought that I began my looking around for Unitarian or Universalist responses in 1942 to Executive Order 9066. I admit I went out hopeful that there was going to be evidence of our faith tradition pushing back against the overwhelming popular complicity with the injustice that they called evacuations. The injustice that they called evacuations. In my first internet queries, I was disappointed to find very few references at all. The one I did find echoes the slide that Jack put up there with a young child with a sandwich in a bag delivered from a church. And it came from the UU Church in San Jose, California. And it was a simple note on the About Us page of that congregation that said, this church was also one of the few voices of opposition to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Along with the Quakers, members of the church went down to the train depot from which the Japanese Americans were departing for the camps. They offered coffee, donuts, and more importantly, moral support. I admit, moral support and donuts felt less like affecting history than being pushed around by it. So I needed to pursue a search. My exploration had to continue. And so I wrote to Dan McCannon. He's the Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Senior Lecturer at Harvard Divinity School. And he's the leading editor of this book called The Documentary History of Unitarian Universalism. It's actually 2 volumes, and I only brought one in to wave around here this morning. And I think it was an attempt, those 2 volumes, an attempt at an exhaustive history of Unitarian and Universalist backgrounds past. So I wrote him an email and I said, Dan, I hadn't found anything in this lovely book that I use about our responses to Japanese American internment, and wondered if you could refer me to any sources that had already explored those responses from the 40s. And it took about a week and a half, but surprisingly, he did actually write back to this lowly little lay minister in Houghton, Michigan. And he started by saying that mine was a good question. Oh, I puffed up a little bit. I got a good question, you know. Then he said, no. Nothing came to mind. He encouraged me to undertake the search of Unitarian archives that are held at the Harvard Library, and he connected me with 2 librarians who work there. As it happens, there may be stories to be told, but those resources are only available to be read in a reading room at the Harvard Library. The librarians advised me those files aren't digitized yet, so I couldn't access them remotely. Recognizing I likely wasn't going to find that Unitarian or Universalist historical nugget that would propel this sermon forward, of course, I reoriented my focus. As Jack described the history of the injustice imposed on Japanese Americans through the implementation of Executive Order 9066, then roughly 4 years of internment, for over 100,000 people, the loss of money, personal goods, property, and the persistent oppression and prejudice imposed upon those same folks as they tried to return to what was once their home. Then you keep that thread going all the way to 1988 and the passage of the Civil Liberties Act, which delivered reparations to the Japanese Americans who had been interned. We need to remember and understand all of that history. If we want to affect history and not just be pushed around by it, we need to be informed by history as we consider today's world and aspire to create a more just future. That's what many UUs call living prophetically. Looking at the world as it is, aspiring to a world as it should be, and thinking and acting so it becomes real. And at the core of all that action is justice. Everything we do has justice in mind. Now, I recognize that prophetic is a charged term for many people. I'm sure there may be a light charge wandering through a few of you right now. Some believe that prophecy is reserved for a few who can receive and transmit the word of God to the masses. There is also a strong sense of challenge to the liberal sense of prophecy as being too easily attained and not significant enough to rise to the level of relaying God's word. As an example, in 2010, I had just finished 5 months of regular meetings with a UU congregation. We were drafting the charter for our social justice ministry. The rewrites of that charter had fallen into a UU abyss of emails back and forth about punctuation and whether or not we should use the article "the" in that sentence or not. And some of you will understand that. Somewhat covered up by those discussions of details was what we were really struggling to write. And what we were really struggling to write was how we were going to engage the prophetic in our congregational life. We were institutionalizing the prophetic process, that process of looking at the world as it is, seeing how it should be, and what was the work we needed to do to make it so. On almost the same day as the board finally approved that social justice ministry charter, a conservative pundit of the time, a man named Glenn Beck, was on TV warning his audience. This is pretty much a quote. This is what I could find. He said, "If your congregation has a social justice ministry, run! Run from that sanctuary as fast as you can." So no sooner had we gotten all the rewrites to our charter finished than it seemed that we landed in a present-day pitched public debate, essentially asking, what is prophecy? Or as Mr. Beck would have framed it, what is false prophecy? And really, the roots of that debate about prophecy go back way further than 2010. I'm going to take us back tonight to the 1500s and the Protestant Reformation. And our prophetic practices have been under transformation since then. It started in about 1520 when Martin Luther called for a priesthood of all believers. Now, I fully recognize that priesthood and believers are not terms that we use too much in UU congregations today. However, the effects of Luther's words are woven into our current experience of Unitarian Universalism. For example, it has been our experience here in Houghton and across the country that whenever 30 people come together and make a covenant with one another, a new UU fellowship is formed. In Unitarian Universalism, we are in service to one another. We minister each other in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So forming fellowship through shared agreement and ministering to one another, that is the priesthood of all believers in action. We don't rely on a clerical class to mediate our experience of the divine or meaningful. As Luther wrote, there is no true basic difference between laymen and priests. They are all of the spiritual estate. I know it's also clear that many current churches struggle with or outright deny the practices of the priesthood of all believers. In his challenge to social justice ministries, Mr. Beck locked in on a congregation's choice to be involved in justice, but in a way, he was trying to reconnect to that kind of pre-Reformation church, that kind of hierarchy. He said in another quote, "If you have a priest pushing social justice, go find another parish. Go alert your bishop and tell them, 'Excuse me, are you down with all this social justice thing? If it's my church, I'm alerting the authorities.'" And if they say, yeah, we're all in on this social justice thing, then I am in the wrong place. His quote, "If it's my church, I'm alerting the authorities." For me, that rekindles 500-year-old tensions, just as he framed it in his language. Instead of arguing with him, I always kind of wanted to share with him, if it's your church, you could be the authority. I offer that quick introduction to the priesthood of all believers as background because UUs today have extended what was then Luther's radical concept to include what is called the prophethood of all believers. I've already made you comfortable with the priesthood of all believers, so I'm not going to spend too much time assuaging any of your uncomfortability with the prophethood of all believers. But that came from a 20th century theologian, Unitarian theologian named James Luther Adams. And he wrote, "We, all of us religiously liberal folks, have long held to the idea of the priesthood of all believers, the idea that all believers have direct access to the ultimate resources of religious life, and that every believer has the responsibility of achieving an explicit faith for free persons." And then he extends that thought to include the prophetic. As an example of this radical laicism, we need to affirm belief in the prophethood of all believers. The prophetic liberal church is not a church in which the prophetic function is assigned merely to a few. And I think right now, if you can hear it in the background, Mr. Beck is screaming at you, "Now's the time to run from this congregation." But back to Adams. The prophetic liberal church is the church in which persons think and work together to interpret the signs and times in light of their faith, to make explicit through discussion the critical thinking that the times demand. To interpret the signs of the times in light of our faith, to be clear with you all, those were the stories I was looking for from the 1940s. Adams closes this section of his thinking with words that made me run to this church, to this faith, and not away from it. He also outlined the seriousness of our sense of prophecy, dispelling the questions that our sense of prophecy is too frivolous. Adams wrote, "The prophetic liberal church is the church in which all members share in a common responsibility to attempt to foresee the consequences of human behavior, both individual and institutional, with the intention of making history rather than merely being pushed around by it." There it is. Only through the prophetism of all believers can we together foresee doom and mend our common ways. Prophetism of all believers. Prophetic thinking is ours to employ. We can be the church that concerns ourselves with the struggle for human decency and justice. And let me try to make this real for you with one example of how UUs came together, foresaw doom, and worked to mend our future, a relatively recent one. It was at the 2012 General Assembly in Phoenix. The General Assembly is the UUA's association annual meeting. Roughly 4,000 UUs rallied outside an inhumane Maricopa County tent jail chanting, "Shut it down." It was a compelling calling out for a very popular sheriff in that Phoenix area. He had been reelected 4 times by 2012. And it should be clear that our efforts didn't end with one grandstanding event at night, which was incredibly powerful to be at, but UUs were plaintiffs in court cases that were brought against the sheriff. Those court cases grew out of what the U.S. Department of Justice concluded was that sheriff oversaw the worst pattern of racial profiling in U.S. history. He would eventually be found guilty of several charges. He would lose his 2016 bid for re-election, and then he would ultimately receive a presidential pardon from our current president. We live in convoluted times. But UU's thinking and acting together affected history instead of being pushed around by it. We engaged the prophethood of all believers. And that's what I was hoping to share with you as a historical example around Executive Order 96. Prophetic thinking and action are part of Unitarian and Universalists' I was hoping we would see that as part of the Unitarian and Universalists in the 1940s. But we're not going to find stories of 4,000 Unitarian and Universalists rallying outside a 1940s tent city chanting, "Shut it down." I think, though, that marking the anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor with a review of the Japanese-American internment reflects the complex tensions that are always present in history. It also compels me to engage prophetic thinking and action as we make our future and the next bit of history. Together, let us be informed by history as we look at today's world and build our aspirations for a world as it should be. I look forward to working with you to make it so.